I'm writing this from a hotel room 3 states away because I can't even process what happened last week. I'm 32 years old and I thought I had my life figured out. Good job in consulting that keeps me traveling. Wife of 6 years named Chelsea. House in the suburbs. Best friend since college named Kane, who I considered my brother. My parents, Ford and Colleen, live 20 minutes away. My younger brother, Wade, still lives with them. Chelsea's parents, Bobby and Destiny, have been part of my life since I was 23. We did holidays together, family vacations, the whole thing. I was supposed to be in Denver until Friday for a client presentation, but we wrapped early on Wednesday. Our 7th anniversary was Thursday, and I had this whole plan to surprise Chelsea with flowers and her favorite takeout from that Italian place she loves. I texted my assistant to order everything, booked a flight that landed at 1 a.m. Thursday morning, and drove straight home from the airport. I was exhausted but excited because Chelsea and I had been in this rut lately where everything felt routine and I wanted to shake things up. The neighborhood was dead quiet when I pulled onto our street at 2 a.m. Every house dark except ours, which had lights on downstairs. And there in my driveway was Kane's black BMW that I'd helped him pick out 2 years ago when he got his promotion. My brain tried to make it make sense because Kane lives across town and we hadn't had plans. Maybe he stopped by to help Chelsea with something. Maybe there was an emergency. But it was 2 a.m. on a Wednesday and his car was in my driveway. I parked on the street and walked up to the front door. It was unlocked. The living room lights were all on and I could hear voices in the kitchen. Multiple voices. I walked through the hallway and stopped in the doorway because sitting at my kitchen table were my parents. My brother Wade, Chelsea's parents Bobby and Destiny, my wife Chelsea, and Kane. 7 people in my kitchen at 2 a.m. like they were having a casual dinner party. There were papers spread across the table and everyone went silent when they saw me. My dad Ford stood up first and told me to sit down. Not hello, not surprised to see me early, just sit down, son, in that flat tone he uses when he's already decided how something is going to go. I stayed in the doorway because nothing about this felt right. My mom, Colleen, was sitting there with her hands folded, and she wouldn't look at me. Wade was staring at the table. Chelsea's mom, Destiny, had this weird expression like she was trying not to smile. Bobby looked uncomfortable, but not surprised. Kane was leaning back in his chair next to Chelsea, and he had his hand on the back of her chair. My wife wasn't looking at me either. I asked what was going on, and my mom slid a stack of papers across the table toward me. Divorce papers, already filled out with my name and Chelsea's name and a lawyer's signature at the bottom. I looked at Chelsea and asked what this was, and she finally looked up at me and told me she was 4 months pregnant with Kane's baby. Just like that. 4 months pregnant with Kane's baby. Said it like she was telling me what she had for lunch. I stood there trying to process, and Kane actually smirked at me. Told me thanks for the house, buddy, because they were going to need it for their family. Their family. My best friend since we were 20 years old, and he was sitting in my kitchen telling me thanks for the house. I looked at my parents because surely they would have something to say about this, and my dad told me they already emptied my trust fund. The $500K trust fund from my grandfather that I'd been saving. Gave it to Chelsea and Kane for the baby. Chelsea's mom, Destiny, chimed in then about how I'd be moving back in with my parents like the loser I was. She actually said that. The woman who'd hugged me at Christmas 3 months ago and told me I was like a son to her was sitting in my kitchen calling me a loser. Bobby didn't say anything, but he didn't disagree either. Wade was still looking at the table like he wanted to disappear. I asked how long this had been going on, and Chelsea told me 8 months. 8 months. We'd been married for 6 years, and she'd been sleeping with my best friend for 8 months. I asked why, and she laughed. Actually laughed and told me I was always too boring and Kane was a real man. Said it right in front of everyone like they'd all discussed this before. Like this was a planned intervention to tell me my marriage was over and I was boring and they'd stolen my money. My dad pushed the divorce papers closer and told me to sign now. Not tomorrow. Not after I talked to a lawyer. Now. At 2 a.m. in my own kitchen with everyone watching. He said they'd already worked everything out and I just needed to sign and make it easy on everyone. My mom finally looked at me and said this was for the best and I needed to be mature about it. I looked at Kane and asked him why, and he told me I'd been too busy traveling for work and someone had to take care of Chelsea. Said it like he'd done me a favor. Like sleeping with my wife while I was working to pay for the house we lived in was him being helpful. Chelsea was nodding along like this made perfect sense. The worst part was how calm they all were. This wasn't a confession or an apology. This was an ambush. They'd planned this entire thing. Got everyone together at 2 a.m. specifically because they knew I was supposed to be in Denver. They'd coordinated this intervention to tell me my life was over and hand me divorce papers and inform me my trust fund was gone. The money my grandfather left me that I'd been saving to start my own firm someday. Gone. Given to my wife and my best friend for their baby. I asked my parents how they could access my trust fund, and my dad said I'd given them power of attorney years ago when I traveled for work in case something happened. He'd been a co-signer on the account. I remembered signing something when I was 25 and just starting my career, and my dad said it was smart to have someone who could handle things if I was out of the country. I never thought he'd use it to steal my inheritance. Bobby finally spoke up and said they all thought this was the right thing to do, that Kane and Chelsea were in love and I needed to accept it and move on. His daughter was pregnant with my best friend's baby, and he was sitting there telling me I needed to accept it. Destiny added that Kane was going to be a better provider anyway because he had a steadier job that didn't require travel. I asked if anyone was going to ask me what I thought, and my mom said I was being selfish, that Chelsea and Kane deserved to be happy, and I was making this harder than it needed to be. Wade still wouldn't look at me, but I saw him wince when she said that. I told them I wasn't signing anything, and I walked out, grabbed my suitcase from the car because I never actually made it inside to unpack, and I drove to a hotel near the airport. Sat in the parking lot until morning trying to figure out what had just happened. My wife was pregnant with my best friend's baby. My parents had stolen my trust fund. My in-laws were on their side. My brother couldn't even look at me. 7 people had gathered in my house at 2 a.m. to ambush me with divorce papers and tell me to move back in with my parents like I was a failure. I didn't sleep. I sat in that hotel room and I got angry. Not sad, not shocked anymore, just absolutely furious. These people had planned this. They'd coordinated schedules and got lawyers involved and transferred my money and then sat in my kitchen like they were doing me a favor. My wife had been screwing my best friend for 8 months. 8 months of coming home from business trips and kissing her and asking about her day while she was pregnant with another man's baby. 8 months of having drinks with Kane and listening to him talk about his life while he was sleeping in my bed. Thursday morning, I started making calls. I found a lawyer who specialized in trust fund disputes and fraud. Explained the whole situation and asked what my options were. Turns out, giving someone power of attorney doesn't give them the right to steal your inheritance. Turns out, transferring $500K without the beneficiary's knowledge or consent is actually illegal. My lawyer was very interested in the fact that my parents had cleaned out my account and given it to my wife and her affair partner. I called my bank and put a freeze on every account my father had access to, called my credit card companies and changed all my passwords. Went through every single financial tie I had to my parents and severed it. My lawyer filed an emergency motion to freeze the $500K transfer, and we submitted a police report for theft and fraud. Real police report with real detectives who were very interested in talking to Ford and Colleen about why they'd stolen their son's inheritance. I hired a private investigator to document everything about Chelsea and Kane, when they were together, where they went, how long this had actually been going on. Got copies of texts and bank statements and found out Kane had been using my house as his personal hotel for months. They'd been having dinners there, spending weekends there while I was traveling. My own house. My lawyer also filed for an emergency restraining order against all of them accessing my house. Changed the locks with a locksmith who came that Friday morning. Had the security system changed so none of them could get in. Froze all the joint accounts with Chelsea and moved my money to new accounts she couldn't touch. Then, I did the one thing they clearly didn't expect. I sent certified letters to every single one of them. My parents, my brother, Chelsea's parents, Chelsea, and Kane. 7 certified letters that required signatures. 7 letters that laid out exactly what I knew and exactly what was going to happen next. The letters to my parents informed them of the police investigation for theft and fraud. Explained that power of attorney doesn't protect them from criminal charges when they steal $500K. Included copies of the police report and the emergency motion. Told them their house was going to be seized as part of the restitution because they'd used stolen money that was now evidence. The letters to Bobby and Destiny explained that they were accessories to fraud because they knew about the stolen money and encouraged the divorce. Explained that they could be held financially liable for the full $500K plus damages. Included documentation of the meeting in my kitchen where they participated in this scheme. The letter to Wade told him he had one chance to decide which side he was on because our parents were going down and he could either distance himself now or go down with them. The letters to Chelsea and Kane informed them that I was filing for divorce on grounds of adultery and fraud. Explained that the house was in my name only because I'd bought it before we got married. Told them they had exactly 0 claim to my property and they'd be evicted within 30 days. Included restraining orders that meant they couldn't come within 500 feet of the house or me. Told them the $500K they received was stolen property and they'd be named in the criminal investigation. All 7 letters arrived on Monday. All 7 people signed for them not knowing what was inside. By Monday evening, my phone was getting calls from numbers I didn't recognize because I'd blocked all of them. They started showing up at my hotel because somehow they figured out where I was staying. Tuesday morning, there were 5 cars outside my hotel at 6 a.m. My parents in their SUV, Wade in his beat-up sedan, Bobby and Destiny in their Lexus, Chelsea and Kane in his BMW. All of them outside my hotel. All of them trying to get to me because suddenly they realized I wasn't signing divorce papers and moving back home like a good little failure. They were calling and texting and showing up at my hotel, and I sat in my room on the 7th floor and watched them from the window. Watched my parents pace in the parking lot. Watched Chelsea crying in Kane's car. Watched Bobby try to call my phone over and over. Watched Destiny argue with my mom while Wade sat in his car alone. My lawyer called Tuesday afternoon and told me the judge approved the emergency motion. The $500K transfer was frozen and marked as evidence in a criminal investigation. My parents' accounts were frozen pending the investigation. The house seizure would proceed if they couldn't prove the funds were legitimate. Chelsea and Kane were officially named in the investigation as recipients of stolen property. Wednesday morning, they were all still there. 5 cars in the hotel parking lot, all of them waiting for me to come down. All of them screaming about how they didn't know it was illegal and I needed to fix this and they'd do anything. My dad left a voicemail saying I was destroying the family. My mom sent a text saying I was being cruel. Chelsea's voicemail was about how she'd made a mistake and we could work this out. Kane's text said I was overreacting. I sat in that hotel room and I didn't feel guilty. I felt vindicated. These people had gathered in my kitchen a week ago and told me my life was over and laughed about it. Had handed me divorce papers at 2 a.m. and told me to sign. Had stolen my inheritance and given it to my cheating wife. And now they were in the parking lot begging me to fix what they'd destroyed. Thursday afternoon, my lawyer called with an update. The police wanted to press charges. The DA was interested in the case because it was clear-cut fraud and theft. My parents were looking at serious prison time if convicted. Bobby and Destiny were likely facing charges as accessories. Chelsea and Kane would have to return the stolen money and could face charges for receiving stolen property. I'm still at this hotel, still watching them circle the parking lot and call my phone and leave voicemails, still listening to them beg and plead and make promises. And I'm not answering. Not one call, not one text, not one voicemail. Because a week ago, they sat in my kitchen and destroyed my entire life with smiles on their faces, and now they're learning what consequences actually look like. Update 1. So the comments on my last post told me I needed to actually talk to Wade because he was the only one who looked uncomfortable during the kitchen ambush. You were right. I finally answered one of his calls Friday morning and told him to meet me at the parking garage downtown where I used to park for work. Public place, cameras everywhere, and far enough from the hotel that the others wouldn't follow. Wade showed up looking like he hadn't slept in days. He's 28 and still living with our parents because he's been saving for a house. Or he was saving until this whole thing exploded. He sat in my car and immediately started talking about how he tried to stop them. I told him trying wasn't good enough and he needed to tell me everything or I was done with him too. Turns out, this wasn't an 8-month affair. It was 18 months. Chelsea and Kane had been sleeping together since before our 5th anniversary. Wade found out 6 months ago when he came home early from work and saw Kane leaving our house in the middle of the afternoon. He confronted our parents and they told him to stay out of it because Chelsea and Kane were in love and I was never home anyway. Our mother actually said I was neglecting my marriage and Kane was stepping up to be the man Chelsea needed. Wade said the pregnancy wasn't an accident. They planned it. Chelsea had been on birth control our entire marriage, but she stopped taking it a year ago specifically so she could get pregnant with Kane's baby. They wanted a child together, and apparently everyone knew except me. My parents knew, her parents knew, Wade knew. They'd been planning this intervention for months, waiting for the right time to tell me. The trust fund theft happened 3 months ago. My dad needed Kane to agree to the divorce timeline, so he promised him and Chelsea the $500K as a wedding gift once my divorce was final. Except the plan was I'd be so broken and compliant that I'd just sign the papers and move back in with my parents, and everyone could pretend this was a mutual decision. They literally had a timeline. Chelsea would tell me about the affair in June, I'd move out, we'd do a quiet divorce, and she and Kane would get married in September. The baby would be born in December, and they'd all celebrate together. I asked Wade why he didn't warn me, and he said he tried calling me twice in January, but I was in Seattle for a client and didn't answer. He left voicemails that just said to call him back, and I was too busy with work to follow up. He said after that our parents told him if he contacted me again, they'd kick him out, and he couldn't afford rent on his own yet. So he stayed quiet and watched them plan this whole thing. The reason everyone was at the house that night was because Chelsea told them I'd texted her that I was coming home early. I didn't text her. I texted my assistant to order flowers and food, but somehow Chelsea got a notification or my assistant mentioned it to someone. Either way, they knew I was coming, and they scrambled to do the intervention that night instead of waiting until I got back from Denver Friday like they originally planned. They wanted to catch me tired and off guard. Wade told me our dad specifically chose 2 a.m. because he read somewhere that people are more compliant when they're exhausted. He researched how to do interventions and found articles about breaking bad news and decided this was the best approach. My own father researched psychological manipulation tactics to use on me. I asked about the house, and Wade said Kane had already been acting like he owned it. He'd redecorated the bedroom, bought new furniture for the living room, installed a new TV. All the changes I thought Chelsea was making while I was traveling were actually Kane making himself at home. Wade had been over there for dinner twice and seen Kane answer the door like he lived there. Our parents had been over for Sunday dinners with Chelsea and Kane while I was working in other cities. Then Wade told me the worst part. Our grandfather's trust fund wasn't supposed to be accessible until I was 35 or got married, whichever came first. When I married Chelsea at 26, the money became available, but my dad convinced me to keep it in trust until I was ready to use it. He'd been the co-trustee since my grandfather died. Turns out he'd been planning to take that money for years. He'd talked about it with our mom since I was 28, saying I didn't need it because I made good money, and they could use it for Wade's college debt or their retirement. When the affair started, he saw an opportunity. My dad told Chelsea and Kane he could get them the money if they timed everything right. He needed me to be emotionally destroyed enough that I wouldn't fight back legally. The whole kitchen ambush was designed to break me down. They were supposed to spend hours talking me into signing the papers, making me feel worthless and alone, until I gave up. They had talking points prepared. Chelsea was supposed to tell me I was boring in bed. Kane was supposed to remind me of all the times I missed important events because of work. My parents were supposed to emphasize that I'd be alone without the family. Destiny was supposed to tell me no other woman would want me. I asked if he had proof, and Wade pulled out his phone. He'd been recording family dinners for the past 2 months because he felt guilty. Had recordings of our parents discussing the timeline, of Bobby and Destiny agreeing to support Chelsea through the divorce, of Kane talking about remodeling our bedroom once I moved out. Hours of recordings of these people planning to destroy my life. Wade said he'd testify if it came to that. Said he'd give me all the recordings. Said he was moving out of our parents' house because he couldn't look at them anymore. He'd been sleeping in his car the last 3 nights because being in that house made him sick. I told him to get a hotel room and sent him $2K right there from my phone. He's my brother, and he was the only one who felt bad about any of this. After Wade left, I went back to the hotel and listened to every recording. 3 hours of my family plotting against me. My dad explaining how he'd transfer the trust fund to a temporary account and then wire it to Kane. My mom talking about how I needed to learn what real consequences felt like because I'd been spoiled my whole life. Bobby saying his daughter deserved better than a husband who was never home. Destiny laughing about how I'd probably cry when they told me. There was one recording from a Sunday dinner at my house where Kane was showing everyone the new bedroom furniture. My mom was saying how nice it looked, and Chelsea was talking about paint colors for the nursery. They were planning the nursery in my house while I was in Chicago for a presentation. Wade's voice on the recording asking if they felt bad, and my dad telling him to grow up, because this was how the real world worked. People who didn't prioritize their marriages lost them. I sent all the recordings to my lawyer Friday afternoon. He called me back in an hour and said this changed everything. The recordings proved premeditation, proved my dad had planned the theft months in advance, proved conspiracy between all of them. The DA could use this for criminal charges. My lawyer could use it for the civil case. We had them on tape admitting to everything. Saturday morning, my lawyer filed an emergency motion to evict Chelsea and Kane from my house immediately based on the recordings. Filed for full restitution of the trust fund plus damages. Added my mother, Bobby, and Destiny to the civil suit as co-conspirators. The judge reviewed everything Saturday afternoon and granted the eviction. Chelsea and Kane had until Monday at noon to remove their belongings from my house. That's when things got really crazy. Chelsea started calling me from different numbers because I'd blocked hers. She got my work number from somewhere and called my office 20 times. Left voicemails about how this was all a misunderstanding and she still loved me. How she'd made a mistake and wanted to work things out. How the baby might be mine after all, and we needed to talk before I did something I'd regret. Kane showed up at the hotel Sunday morning. Hotel security called my room and said someone was demanding to see me and should they call the police. I told them yes, call the police, because he had a restraining order. Watched from my window as 2 cops talked to Kane in the parking lot. Watched them explain that he couldn't be there and if he came back he'd be arrested. He was yelling about how I was ruining his life and he'd done nothing wrong, and I was the one who abandoned my marriage. My parents tried a different approach. They got my Aunt Layton to call me. My dad's sister, who I hadn't talked to in a year because she lives in Arizona. She left this long voicemail about family loyalty and how I needed to forgive my parents because they were just trying to help. Said my dad made a mistake, but he was still my father and I was being cruel. I called her back and told her everything. Every single detail, including the recordings. She went quiet for a long time and then told me she'd call me back. Monday morning, Chelsea and Kane had to face the eviction. My lawyer arranged for a moving company and a sheriff's deputy to oversee everything. I wasn't there, but my lawyer was, and he took photos. They'd been living in my house like it was theirs. Kane's clothes in my closet. His toiletries in my bathroom. The nursery was already half painted with furniture assembled. They'd bought a crib and a changing table and baby clothes. Had been building their life in my house while waiting for me to sign papers and disappear. The movers took everything of theirs and put it in storage. The deputy made sure they didn't take anything of mine. My lawyer said Chelsea was crying the whole time and Kane was arguing about how this was his house too because he'd been living there. The deputy explained that his name wasn't on the deed or lease, and he was trespassing. Kane tried to say he'd paid rent but couldn't produce any evidence. They took everything and changed the locks again, just to be sure. Chelsea called me from her parents' house Monday afternoon. She'd moved back in with Bobby and Destiny temporarily while Kane found them an apartment. She was talking about how unfair this was and how I was punishing her for being honest. Said she'd told me the truth because she loved me enough to be real with me, and now I was destroying her life over a mistake. I asked her which mistake. The 18-month affair, the planned pregnancy, the conspiracy to steal my money, or the kitchen ambush where everyone I loved told me I was worthless. She said all of it was complicated and I wouldn't understand because I was too focused on work to see what she needed. I asked her what she needed, and she told me she needed a partner who was present. Someone who came home every night and paid attention to her. Someone who made her feel special and desired and loved. She said I'd stopped doing all that years ago and Kane had stepped in to give her what I couldn't. She'd fallen in love with him because he was there and I wasn't. I asked if she'd ever tried talking to me about it and she said she'd tried dropping hints, but I never noticed. Hints like asking me to work from home more or commenting that Kane was sweet for bringing her coffee when I was traveling. I was supposed to somehow interpret that as my wife sleeping with my best friend for 18 months. Bobby got on the phone and told me I needed to be reasonable. His daughter was pregnant and stressed, and I was making everything worse with lawyers and police. He said families work things out privately, and I was airing dirty laundry that should stay internal. I asked if he thought stealing $500K was dirty laundry or a felony, and he said I was being dramatic. That my dad had made a financial decision I didn't agree with, but it wasn't theft because we were family. I told Bobby that his involvement made him an accessory to fraud, and he'd be lucky if he didn't go to prison with my dad. He started yelling about how I was threatening him and he'd never done anything wrong, how he'd supported his daughter through a difficult marriage and I was punishing him for being a good father. I hung up. My lawyer called Tuesday with more news. The DA was officially pressing charges against my dad for theft and fraud, against my mom as an accessory, against Chelsea and Kane for receiving stolen property with knowledge of its origin, because the recordings proved they knew the money was from my trust fund. Bobby and Destiny were under investigation. The criminal case was moving forward. The civil case was also progressing. My lawyer filed for full restitution of the $500K plus $300K in damages for emotional distress and conspiracy. Filed liens against my parents' house, Bobby and Destiny's house, and Kane's car. Froze all their bank accounts pending resolution. The judge approved everything because the recordings made it clear this was coordinated theft. Wade called me Tuesday night from a hotel near his work. He'd given his formal statement to the police and the DA, handed over all the recordings. He said our parents were destroying the house looking for something to prove I'd agreed to the trust fund transfer. They couldn't find anything because I never agreed. My dad had forged my signature on the transfer paperwork, and the bank was cooperating with the investigation. I asked Wade what our parents were saying, and he told me they were alternating between rage and panic. Our dad was talking about how I'd destroyed the family over money. Our mom was calling me ungrateful and cruel. They'd hired a lawyer, but he'd told them the recordings made their defense nearly impossible. They were looking at prison time and losing their house. Chelsea's parents were in similar panic. Bobby's business was struggling because his accounts were frozen and he couldn't make payroll. He'd laid off 3 employees and the rest were worried about their jobs. Destiny was calling everyone she knew, trying to get me to back down. She'd contacted my old boss, my college friends, distant relatives, everyone telling her there was nothing they could do because I wasn't wrong. Kane had lost his job. His company found out about the criminal investigation and put him on leave pending resolution. He was living with Chelsea at her parents' house because he couldn't afford his apartment anymore. The BMW was getting repossessed because he'd bought it with money he now couldn't access and missed 2 payments. His whole life was falling apart. And mine? I was still in that hotel room watching all of this unfold. I'd taken a leave of absence from work because I couldn't focus on client presentations while dealing with this. My boss was supportive once I explained the situation. Told me to take all the time I needed, and my job would be waiting. The 5 cars were back in the parking lot Wednesday morning, all of them desperate and angry and scared. But this time they weren't just begging, they were threatening. My dad left a voicemail about how I'd regret this and family was everything. Destiny sent a text about how I was killing Bobby's business and employees were suffering because of my selfishness. Kane's message said I'd pay for destroying his life. My Aunt Layton called Wednesday afternoon. She'd talked to our dad and heard his version of events. Then she'd talked to Wade and heard the recordings. She told me she was flying in this weekend and she wanted to meet with me. She had some things to tell me about our dad that I needed to know. Things about why he thought he could take my money and get away with it. I'm meeting her Saturday at a restaurant across town. Wade is coming too, and apparently there is more to this story that I still don't know. Update 2. The meeting with Aunt Layton was Saturday at a steakhouse downtown. I got there first, and Wade showed up 10 minutes later looking exhausted. He'd been staying at a hotel near his work and spending every day giving statements to lawyers and police. Aunt Layton arrived right on time wearing jeans and a blazer, and she hugged both of us before we even sat down. She ordered a whiskey and told us this was going to be a long conversation. Then she asked me what I knew about our grandfather's will and the trust fund. I told her what my dad had always said, that Grandpa left me money because I was the first grandson and he wanted to make sure I had a good start in life. Aunt Layton shook her head and said that wasn't the whole story. Our grandfather had 3 kids. My dad Ford, Aunt Layton, and their younger brother who died in a car accident when he was 19. When the younger brother died, Grandpa updated his will to split everything 3 ways between his remaining kids. But he also set up individual trust funds for any grandchildren, and the amounts were based on which parent they came from. My dad got $200K for his kids. Aunt Layton got $200K for hers, and the younger brother's theoretical children would have gotten $100K, except my dad convinced Grandpa to change it. He argued that since the younger brother was dead and had no kids, that $100K should be split between his kids and Layton's kids. Grandpa agreed, but with a condition. The money could only go to grandchildren who graduated college and maintained steady employment for at least 5 years. My dad had 2 kids, Wade and me. Layton had 1 daughter who was living in Seattle. The money would be split 3 ways, roughly $300K each, once we met the conditions. I graduated college at 22 and had been working in consulting for 10 years. I'd met the conditions years ago. Wade graduated at 23 and had been working for 5 years as of last month. He'd just met the conditions. Layton's daughter graduated at 24 and had been working for 3 years, so she hadn't qualified yet. Here's what my dad didn't tell us. When I met the conditions at 27, I should have received $300K. Instead, my dad told me it was $500K, and I believed him because why would I question my own father about my inheritance? He'd been skimming money from the trust for years, using his position as co-trustee to take small amounts that wouldn't trigger audits. By the time I qualified, he'd already taken $200K and covered it up by inflating the amount he told me I had. Wade was supposed to receive his $300K this year, except there was no money left because my dad had stolen it all. He'd taken my $300K, Wade's $300K, and even part of Layton's daughter's future $300K. He'd been systematically draining the trust fund for almost a decade, and nobody knew because he was the trustee, and Grandpa had trusted him completely. Aunt Layton found out 3 months ago when she requested documents for her daughter's upcoming qualification. The bank sent her statements, showing the trust fund was nearly empty. She confronted my dad, and he admitted he'd been borrowing from it with plans to pay it back. He'd invested in some business ventures that failed, used it to pay off his mortgage, bought my mom a new car, funded Wade's college expenses that were supposed to come from a separate education fund. He'd spent almost $900K total from a trust that was supposed to have $900K. When Layton threatened to report him, he told her he had a plan to fix it. He was going to arrange for me to transfer my inheritance to Chelsea and Kane, make it look legitimate like a gift, and then he'd claim I'd already been paid and the trust was settled. He'd forged documents showing the trust had been properly distributed. Wade wouldn't get his money, but my dad would tell him there were complications with the estate and it was tied up in probate. By the time anyone figured out what happened, my dad would have covered his tracks and retired to Florida. I sat there listening to this and trying to process. My father had stolen from me, from Wade, from Layton's daughter. had planned to frame me as complicit in dismantling the trust, had used Chelsea's affair as an opportunity to cover up years of theft. The kitchen ambush wasn't just about getting rid of me so Chelsea and Kane could be together. It was about my dad covering up the fact that he'd embezzled almost $1 million from his own family. Wade was white and shaking. He'd just found out he was never getting his inheritance because our father had stolen it before Wade even qualified. The money he'd been counting on to buy a house, to start his adult life, was gone. Our dad had stolen his future and was planning to lie about it forever. Aunt Layton said she had all the bank statements and trust documents. She'd been working with her own lawyer to figure out how to handle this without destroying the family. Then my situation happened and she realized my dad was never going to stop. He'd steal from his own kids and justify it because he felt entitled to that money. He'd spent years telling himself he deserved it more than we did because he'd raised us and sacrificed for us and we owed him. She handed me a folder with copies of everything, bank statements showing withdrawals over 9 years, forged documents with my grandfather's signature, transfer records to my dad's personal accounts, investment records for failed businesses. It was all there. Evidence that my dad had been a thief for almost a decade. I asked why she hadn't reported him, and she said family loyalty. She'd hoped he'd find a way to pay it back. She'd believed him when he said he had a plan. She'd trusted her brother even when she knew he was stealing. But after seeing what he did to me, after hearing those recordings Wade gave me, she was done protecting him. She wanted me to use this information however I needed to. My lawyer was going to love this. Not only did we have evidence of the trust fund theft being premeditated, we now had evidence of nearly a decade of embezzlement. My dad wasn't just looking at charges for stealing my $500K. He was looking at charges for stealing almost $900K from multiple people over multiple years. This was way bigger than I thought. Wade asked if he could sue our parents to get his money back and Layton said yes. She was already planning to sue for her daughter's portion. Between the three of us, we could probably force my parents to sell everything they owned and still not recover the full amount. They'd spent too much of it, and the rest was tied up in bad investments that had tanked. I drove back to the hotel after dinner and sent everything to my lawyer. He called me at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night after reviewing the documents. He said this changed the entire case. The DA would want to pursue additional charges. The civil case could expand to include Wade and Layton's daughter as plaintiffs. My dad was looking at serious prison time, possibly 10 to 15 years if convicted on all counts. Sunday morning, my phone started ringing at 6 a.m., my mom calling from a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I wanted to hear what excuse she'd come up with. She told me I needed to stop this insanity because I was killing my father. He hadn't slept in days, and his blood pressure was through the roof, and I was destroying him over a misunderstanding about money. I asked her if she knew about the embezzlement, and she went quiet. Then she said she'd known Ford had borrowed from the trust fund, but he'd promised to pay it back. She'd known for 5 years and never said anything. Had watched him steal from his own children and justified it because he was stressed about retirement, and I made good money anyway, so I didn't need the inheritance. I told her she was an accessory to embezzlement, and she started crying. Said I was her son and I was supposed to protect the family, not tear it apart. That I was being selfish and cruel, and I'd regret this when my father was in prison and Wade wouldn't speak to me and the whole family was destroyed. I asked where Wade factored into her concern about family, and she said Wade would understand eventually, that he was young and didn't need the money yet, and Ford would have figured something out before Wade bought a house. She genuinely believed it was okay that our dad stole Wade's inheritance because Wade was younger and could wait. Chelsea tried a different approach Sunday afternoon. She showed up at my office building because she'd figured out I wasn't actually at the hotel anymore. I'd moved to a different hotel across town 3 days ago, specifically because they'd found the first one. She was standing in the lobby with her hand on her pregnant belly looking exhausted, and I almost felt bad until I remembered everything she'd done. She told me we needed to talk about the baby, and I said there was nothing to talk about. She insisted the timing was unclear, and the baby might be mine, and we should do a paternity test before I destroyed everyone's lives. I told her the recordings proved she'd stopped birth control specifically to get pregnant with Kane's baby, and she started crying, said she'd made mistakes, but she still loved me and we could work this out if I just gave her a chance. I asked her what working it out looked like, and she said we could go to counseling. She'd end things with Kane. We'd raise the baby together regardless of paternity. I could forgive her, and we'd start over. She'd be a better wife, and I could be a better husband, and we'd fix our marriage. I asked if she'd worked this out with Kane, and she said Kane didn't matter anymore. He'd lost his job and couldn't support her. His BMW was repossessed. He was living with her parents and couldn't even afford his own place. She'd realized he wasn't the man she thought he was, and she wanted to come back to me because I was stable and successful and could provide for her and the baby. She actually said that. She wanted to come back because Kane turned out to be a loser, and I had money. After 18 months of sleeping with my best friend and planning my destruction, She wanted me to take her back because her affair partner couldn't afford to support her anymore. I told her to leave, and she grabbed my arm. Started talking about how I was being vindictive and hurting an innocent baby, how her parents were losing their house because of the liens, and she had nowhere to go. How Kane's family was blaming her for ruining their son's life, and she needed me to call off the lawyers and the police because she was 4 months pregnant and too stressed. Building security came over and asked if everything was okay. I told them Chelsea was trespassing and needed to be removed. She started yelling about how I was heartless and cruel, and she was carrying my child. Security escorted her out, while she screamed about how I'd regret this and the baby deserved better. Kane's parents contacted me Monday. I don't know how they got my number, but Kane's mom, Cody, left a voicemail about how I was destroying her son over a relationship issue, how Kane had made a mistake, but everyone makes mistakes, and I was being unreasonable, how her son was a good man who had lost everything, and I needed to drop the charges in the lawsuits and let him rebuild his life. I called her back and told her that her son had spent 18 months sleeping with my wife in my house while plotting to steal my inheritance, that he'd participated in fraud and conspiracy and was facing criminal charges because he'd committed actual crimes, that his life was ruined because of his own choices and I wasn't responsible for protecting him from consequences. She said I was vindictive and bitter and I'd turned a private matter into a legal circus, that Kane and Chelsea were in love and I should have let them go peacefully, that involving lawyers and police was excessive and showed I was unstable. I asked if she'd feel the same way if someone stole $500K from her, and she hung up. Bobby's business officially closed Monday afternoon. He'd laid off everyone 2 weeks ago when his accounts got frozen, and now he was filing for bankruptcy. 15 years building that business, and it was gone because he'd participated in conspiracy to commit fraud. His employees were posting on social media about how they'd lost their jobs right before the holidays, and several of them had figured out it was connected to me. I started getting messages from people I'd never met, asking me to have mercy on Bobby because he had employees who needed those jobs. People telling me I was hurting innocent families over a marital dispute. Someone created a whole post about how I was using my money and lawyers to destroy a small business owner because my wife cheated. The thing is, I didn't destroy Bobby's business. Bobby destroyed his business when he participated in stealing my inheritance and conspiring to defraud me. His accounts weren't frozen because I was vindictive. They were frozen because a judge determined he'd been part of a criminal conspiracy, but somehow I was the villain. Wade moved his stuff into my house Monday night. I'd given him keys after the eviction, and he'd been slowly moving things in. He couldn't afford his hotel anymore, and I told him to live in the house rent-free until this was settled. He was the only family member who'd help me, and he deserved somewhere stable to stay. He'd lost his inheritance, his relationship with our parents, and his sense of security. The least I could do was give him a place to live. Tuesday morning, my lawyer called with an update. The DA had added additional charges against my dad based on Aunt Layton's evidence. He was now facing 15 counts of embezzlement, fraud, and forgery. My mom was facing 5 counts as an accessory. Chelsea and Kane were each facing 3 counts related to receiving stolen property and conspiracy. Bobby and Destiny were each facing 2 counts as accessories. The civil case had expanded to include Wade and Layton's daughter as plaintiffs seeking restitution. We were collectively suing my parents for $900K plus damages. The judge had approved liens on their house, their cars, their retirement accounts, everything. They'd lose it all and still owe money. My dad tried to call me Tuesday night from yet another number. He was crying and telling me I was killing him, that the stress was too much and he was having chest pains and I needed to fix this before he had a heart attack. He said I was his son and I was supposed to love him and forgive him, and we were family, and family didn't destroy each other over money. I told him he'd destroyed his family when he stole from his own children, when he'd spent years embezzling and then tried to frame me to cover it up, when he'd orchestrated the kitchen ambush and told me I was worthless. He said he'd been desperate and made bad choices, but he'd never meant to hurt me. I asked what he thought stealing my entire inheritance was, if not hurting me, and he said I didn't understand the pressure he'd been under. Turns out my dad had a gambling problem nobody knew about. He'd been betting on sports for years and losing consistently. The embezzled money had mostly gone to covering gambling debts. He told my mom it was bad investments, but really he'd been hemorrhaging money on online betting sites and casino trips. He'd taken almost $1 million from his own family and gambled it away. He wanted me to feel sorry for him, wanted me to understand he had an addiction and needed help, not prison. I told him he should have gotten help before he stole from his children and hung up. Chelsea left a voicemail Wednesday about the paternity test. She wanted to do it before the baby was born, and if it was mine, she wanted full custody and child support. If it was Kane's, then she'd leave me alone, but I still needed to drop the charges because the stress was bad for the baby. She'd gone from begging me to take her back to demanding I pay for a baby that probably wasn't mine. My lawyer said we'd do the paternity test after the birth, and if the baby was mine, we'd deal with it then. If the baby was Kane's, then Chelsea would have bigger problems because she'd still be facing criminal charges for receiving stolen property. Thursday, the foreclosure notice was served on my parents' house. They had 30 days to vacate because the lien amount exceeded the equity, and the bank was seizing it as part of the restitution. My mom called Wade crying about how they'd lose everything and have nowhere to go, and Wade needed to convince me to stop this. Wade told her he'd lost his inheritance because they'd stolen it, and he wasn't helping them avoid consequences. She said he was betraying his family, and he said they'd betrayed him first. She threatened to cut him off completely, and he said she'd already done that when she chose to help Dad steal his money. Bobby and Destiny's house got the same notice Friday. Foreclosure in 30 days. Destiny called me screaming about how I was making her pregnant daughter homeless. How Chelsea was going to give birth in a shelter because of me. How I was the worst person she'd ever met and karma would get me eventually. I asked where they'd expected me to live after signing the divorce papers, and she said that was different because I could afford a hotel. Chelsea couldn't afford anything because Kane had no job and Bobby's business was closed. I asked whose fault that was, and she hung up. The criminal trial was scheduled for March. The civil case would follow after the criminal convictions. My lawyer estimated the whole thing would take 9 months to a year to fully resolve. 9 months of court dates and testimonies and watching my entire family face the consequences of their coordinated betrayal. Wade asked me Friday night if I ever felt guilty, and I told him no. These people had gathered in my kitchen and told me my life was over, had stolen my money and laughed about it, had planned this for months knowing it would destroy me. They'd gotten exactly what they deserved, and I wasn't sorry. But there was one more complication I wasn't expecting. My company called Friday afternoon and told me they needed to put me on administrative leave. Too many people were contacting them about the situation with Bobby's employees. Too much drama affecting my professional reputation. They weren't firing me, but they needed me to step back until this was resolved. So now I had no job, no family except Wade, no wife, no home I could actually live in, and 9 months of legal proceedings ahead of me. Everyone around me was losing everything, but somehow I felt like I was losing too. Final update. The preliminary hearings started in January, and that's when I finally saw all of them in the same room again. My parents, sitting with their lawyer looking 20 years older. Chelsea next to Kane, both of them wearing cheap clothes because they couldn't afford anything nice anymore. Bobby and Destiny on the other side, looking bitter. Wade sitting with me and Aunt Layton on the prosecution side because we were witnesses and victims. My dad tried to approach me in the courthouse hallway, and 2 bailiffs stopped him because of the restraining order. He stood 15 feet away and tried talking to me anyway, saying we could still fix this if I just dropped the charges. His lawyer pulled him back, but he kept going on about how I was his son and he'd made mistakes, but this didn't have to destroy the whole family. I turned around and walked away. Chelsea cornered me in the parking garage after the first hearing. She was 6 months pregnant and showing, and she used that belly like a weapon, stood in front of my car and refused to move while telling me the baby was mine and I was abandoning my child. I told her we'd do a paternity test after birth, and until then she needed to get away from my car. She started crying about how she had nowhere to live, and Kane was useless, and she'd made a mistake. But didn't I care about the baby at all? I asked her where she was living, and she said they'd rented a 1-bedroom apartment across town using Kane's unemployment checks. Kane was working part-time at a grocery store because nobody would hire him with pending criminal charges. They were barely making rent, and she was terrified about what would happen when the baby came. She wanted me to give her money, drop the charges, let her move back into the house, wanted me to save her from the consequences of her own choices. I told her she should have thought about that before she spent 18 months planning my destruction, and she said I was cruel, that the man she married would never have been this vindictive and cold. I told her the man she married died in that kitchen when 7 people ambushed him at 2 a.m., and maybe she should have appreciated him while he was alive. She screamed that I was going to regret this when my child grew up without a father, and I drove away while she was still yelling. The trial itself took 3 weeks in March. The prosecution had the recordings, the bank statements, the forged documents, testimony from Wade and Aunt Layton, and multiple bank employees. My dad's lawyer tried arguing that family money was complicated, and my dad had made errors in judgment but not criminal acts. The prosecution showed the jury evidence of 9 years of systematic theft, and the jury deliberated for 4 hours. My dad was convicted on 12 counts, my mom on 4 counts as an accessory. Chelsea and Kane were convicted on 2 counts each for receiving stolen property with knowledge of its criminal origin. Bobby and Destiny were convicted on 1 count each as accessories after the fact. The sentencing hearing was set for May. Between the conviction and sentencing, things got worse for all of them. My parents lost their house in foreclosure. and moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a bad neighborhood. My mom was working at a retail store at 60 years old because they had no money. My dad couldn't find work anywhere, with pending sentencing hanging over him. Bobby and Destiny lost their house, too. They moved in with Destiny's sister 2 hours away, and Bobby was working at a hardware store. 15 years running his own business, and now he was stocking shelves and living in someone else's house. Destiny blamed me for everything, told anyone who would listen that I'd destroyed their lives over a marital dispute. Kane's parents stopped talking to him. They'd mortgaged their house to pay for his lawyer, and when he was convicted anyway, they cut him off completely. Told him he'd made his choices and now he had to live with them. Kane and Chelsea were both working minimum wage jobs trying to save money for the baby and failing. They fought constantly, according to Wade, who heard about it through mutual friends. The sentencing hearing in May was brutal. My dad got 8 years in federal prison. My mom got 3 years. Chelsea and Kane each got 2 years, but the judge allowed them to delay reporting until after the baby was born, given Chelsea's pregnancy. Bobby got 18 months and Destiny got probation plus community service. My dad cried during sentencing and begged the judge for leniency. Talked about how he had a gambling addiction and needed treatment, not prison. The judge told him he'd had years to seek treatment and instead, he'd stolen from his own children. My mom just sat there looking blank. Chelsea sobbed and Kane looked angry. The civil case went to trial in June. Wade, Aunt Layton's daughter, and I were awarded full restitution of the stolen trust funds plus damages. $900K in restitution plus $400K in damages split between us. The judge ordered my parents to liquidate every asset, garnish any future wages, and pay monthly restitution after their prison terms ended. They'd be paying it back until they died. Bobby and Destiny were ordered to pay $150K in damages for their participation. They'd spend the next 20 years making monthly payments they couldn't afford. Kane had no assets to seize, so his wages would be garnished for life. Chelsea's wages would be garnished after she returned from maternity leave, assuming she found a job. None of them would ever fully pay back what they owed. My lawyer said I'd maybe recover 40% over the next 30 years if I was lucky. But that wasn't the point. The point was they'd spend the rest of their lives financially destroyed, watching money get taken from every paycheck, never able to buy homes or new cars or take vacations. They'd be poor forever because of what they'd done. Chelsea gave birth in July, a boy. She asked me to come to the hospital, and I refused. She had the paternity test done, and it came back that Kane was the father with 99.9% certainty. She called me crying about how she'd been so sure it was mine and now she was stuck with Kane, and she'd made such a terrible mistake. I told her she'd made her choices and hung up. Kane reported to prison in August after the baby was born. Chelsea moved back in with Destiny's sister because she couldn't afford the apartment alone. She was working part-time at a call center, and her mom was watching the baby. She'd gone from living in my house planning a nursery to living in someone else's spare room working minimum wage with a baby whose father was in prison. My parents reported to prison in September. Wade and I didn't visit. We didn't write letters. We didn't send money for commissary. Aunt Layton visited them once to tell them face-to-face that they'd destroyed their family over greed, and she hoped prison gave them time to think about what they'd done. My dad tried to apologize, and she walked out mid-sentence. My company brought me back in October after 9 months of administrative leave. They'd monitored the situation, and once the criminal convictions came through, they decided I'd been the victim and could return. I'd lost 9 months of income and career momentum, but I still had my job. I was behind on the partnership track, but I was employed. Wade got a better job at a tech company in November. He'd spent the year dealing with the trauma of discovering his parents were thieves and his inheritance was gone. The civil judgment gave him $300K, which he'd see maybe $120K of over the next 30 years. Not the future he'd planned, but better than nothing. He was still living in my house, and we'd become actually close for the first time in our lives. I moved back into the house in December, had it deep cleaned and repainted, and bought all new furniture. Got rid of every trace of Chelsea and Kane. Wade had the upstairs and I had the downstairs, and we lived there like roommates. It wasn't the life I'd imagined at 32, but it was mine, and nobody had stolen it from me. Chelsea sent me a message in December, asking if I'd consider helping with baby expenses since Kane was in prison and she was struggling. I blocked her number. She tried reaching out through mutual friends, and I told them all to stay out of it. She'd chosen Kane, gotten pregnant with his baby, participated in stealing my money, and now she wanted me to bail her out. Not happening. The people who'd lost their jobs when Bobby's business closed stopped blaming me after the criminal convictions made the news. Once they understood Bobby hadn't been an innocent victim but an actual participant in fraud, most of them backed off. A few still thought I should have handled it privately, but they weren't my problem. My ex-boss, my old friends, extended family members, everyone had opinions about what I should have done differently, should have been more forgiving, should have handled it privately, should have thought about the baby, should have considered my parents' age, should have been the bigger person. I stopped engaging with all of it because these people didn't sit in that kitchen at 2 a.m. and watch their entire life get destroyed by people they trusted. Aunt Layton and I talk every week. She says our dad writes her letters from prison asking her to convince me to forgive him. She tears them up without reading past the first paragraph. Her daughter got her portion of the civil judgment and is using it to buy a house in Seattle. The three of us survivors building our lives from the wreckage our family created. Wade asked me last week if I ever regretted how hard I went after them, and I told him no. These people had coordinated my destruction for months, had stolen almost $1 million, had gathered in my kitchen and laughed while they handed me divorce papers and told me I was worthless. They'd gotten exactly what they deserved, and if I could go back, I'd do the same thing again. Some people think I'm vindictive and cruel, that I destroyed multiple lives over money and betrayal, that I should have been more forgiving or handled it through mediation or let it go. Those people can think whatever they want because they didn't live it. They didn't watch their best friend smirk while sitting next to their pregnant wife, didn't listen to their mother call them selfish for being upset about their father stealing their inheritance, didn't hear 7 people explain why they deserve to lose everything. I'm not sorry. I'm not guilty. I'm not conflicted. I sleep fine at night knowing my parents are in prison and Chelsea is struggling and Kane lost everything and Bobby's business is gone. They chose their actions and I chose mine, and consequences exist whether people like them or not. My dad will be 70 when he gets out of prison. My mom will be 66. They'll have nothing except garnished wages and the knowledge that they destroyed their family over gambling debts and greed. Chelsea will be raising Kane's child alone while he serves his sentence, working minimum wage with no prospects. Kane will be 34 when he gets out with a felony record and wage garnishment for life. Bobby and Destiny will spend 20 years making restitution payments and never recover financially. And me? I'm 33, living in my house with my brother, working my job, rebuilding my career. I lost 9 months of income and my entire family except Wade and Aunt Layton. I'm not married and probably won't trust anyone enough to try again for a long time. I'm not whole, and I'm not healed, and I'm not over it. But I won. They tried to destroy me and I destroyed them instead. They coordinated an ambush and I turned it into justice. They thought I'd be compliant and broken, and instead, I was vindicated and ruthless. That's what happens when you gather in someone's kitchen at 2 a.m. and tell them their life is over. You better make sure you can actually end them because if they survive, they're coming back harder than you ever imagined.